If you have ever listened to What's Going On, you have heard them. They arrive before Marvin sings a single word. Voices, laughing, talking over each other. A low murmur of conversation. A warmth of people gathered together that feels less like a produced opening to an album and more like arriving late to a party and standing in the doorway for a moment, taking in the room. For 50 years, most people who heard those voices assumed they were planned. Session musicians following a producer's instructions. Motown staff directed to simulate a social atmosphere. A deliberate artistic choice executed with the same precision that Motown applied to everything it released. They were not planned. The voices at the beginning of What's Going On are there because of a night in 1970 when a small group of people ended up in Marvin Gaye's studio after hours, when the session had run later than anyone expected, and when Marvin made a decision that was so quick and so instinctive that the people who were there almost didn't recognize it as a decision at all. He simply left the tape running. To understand why that mattered, why leaving a tape running in a room full of people talking produced something that has been heard by tens of millions of listeners and recognized by the musicians and producers who studied the album most carefully as one of its defining moments, you have to understand what the album was trying to be. Marvin had been recording What's Going On for months, in sessions that had moved deliberately away from the Motown model. The Motown model was built on control. Controlled arrangements, controlled performances, controlled production that took raw material and shaped it into a specific, reliable sound. What Marvin was making was built on something different. He wanted the record to feel like life, not like a simulation of life, not like a carefully constructed representation of how life sounds, but like the actual texture of people together in a room, talking about things that mattered, finding the meaning underneath the ordinary conversation of an evening. What the tape captured was not a performance. It was people talking, laughing at something someone said, a voice making a point, another voice responding, a third voice laughing in the background. The specific content of the conversations is not clearly audible on the final recording. It was never intended to be, which is part of its effect. What you hear is not words, but warmth, not information, but presence. The unmistakable sound of people who are comfortable with each other, in a room, in an evening, present in the ordinary way that people are present when no one is asking anything of them. Marvin listened back to the tape the following day. The engineer who was present for this later described it simply. Marvin played back the room recording, listened through it once, and said, without further explanation, as if the decision had already been made before he heard the tape, that the opening was there. That the album would begin with this, with the sound of people before the music starts, before the formal statement begins, before anyone in the room has been asked to be anything other than themselves. The decision was significant in a way that extended far beyond the production of a single album. It was a statement about who the music was for. Motown records, in their standard form, began with the music. The performers arrived, the arrangements began, the carefully constructed sound that Gordy had developed and protected was present from the first bar. The audience was addressed as an audience, as people who had come to receive something. What's Going On began by placing the audience inside a room full of people like them, people talking about things they recognized, people whose presence on the record established, before a single note of music had been played, that this album was not a product being delivered from a stage. It was a conversation that the listener was being invited into. The night in question had begun as an ordinary extended session. The Funk Brothers, the group of studio musicians who had played on virtually every Motown record since the early 1960s, whose collective skill was the musical foundation on which the label's entire output rested, had been in the studio for most of the day. By late evening, the formal work of the session was largely done. The musicians were unwinding in the way that musicians unwind after a long day in a studio, talking, playing fragments of things that were not being recorded. The ordinary social decompression of people who have been working intensely together. There were also veterans in or near the studio that night. Marvin's brother Frankie had served in Vietnam, and his return, and the stories he brought back with him, had been one of the primary emotional catalysts for the album. Some of the people who had gathered that evening had their own connections to the war, their own experiences of a country that was, in 1970, deeply and publicly divided about what it owed to the people it had sent to fight and then received back without adequate ceremony or support. This was the world the album was about, not abstractly, not as a political position or a cultural statement, but concretely. These specific people in this specific city with these specific things on their minds. The conversations that moved through that studio in the late evening were the conversations that What's Going On was trying to give musical form to. Marvin understood this. He understood it the way an artist understands things that the technical part of the process can't capture, intuitively, before the reasoning catches up. The tape was already loaded, the machine was already warm, and the thing he had been trying to create, a record that felt like real people thinking out loud about a world that was failing them, was happening, without staging, in the room around him. He left the tape running. What's Going On was released on May 21, 1971. The voices that open it have been heard in the 5 decades since by every person who has ever pressed play, by the people who bought the original Motown pressing in 1971, by everyone who has streamed it since, by the musicians and producers and critics who have written about it and studied it, and pointed to it as evidence of what popular music is capable of when it is made with complete conviction. Most of them heard those voices without knowing whose they were or how they came to be there. They heard them as atmosphere, as a production choice, as a textural decision, as the opening of an album that had been carefully designed to place the listener inside a specific emotional space before the music began. They were not wrong about the effect. They were simply unaware of the cause. The voices are there because of an evening in 1970 when a group of people, musicians, veterans, Detroiters, people who had something to say about the country they were living in, ended up in a studio together, talking, while a tape machine ran, and a man who had been searching for the right sound for his most important album finally found it in the room he was already in. Not because he designed it, because he recognized it when it was happening, and had the instinct to let it continue, and understood, in the wordless way that artists understand the things that matter, that this was the opening he had been looking for. The voices are not actors. They are not session musicians following a script. They are people, real people, in a real room, on a real evening, talking about the real world. That is why, 50 years later, they still sound like the first thing the album needs to say. Before the music, before the question, before everything else. just the sound of people gathered together, present. That is where What's Going On begins.